and soon to be joining us, Gail Walker. Gail is the co-national coordinator of the National Network on Cuba. And she is calling my phone to want to know our connection. So I will pause for a second. Hello, Gail.
I apologize, Jeff. I can't find the link.
Okay, I will send it to you.
Where would it have come from? Would it come from you, your name? Or?
Yeah, it would come from me.
Okay, I don't know why I'm not finding it. Oh.
Right, excuse me, folks. Let's see.
Something that says you were going to send it.
Here we go. Okay, Gail Walker. I just sent it.
Are you sending it to director at IFCO News or to Gail Walker?
I just sent it to you now. Let's see, I sent it to director at ifconews.com.
No, .org.
Oh, no wonder. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't got it yet.
Okay. Director at IFCO.
It's ifconews.org.
Got it. Okay, you should have it in a second.
Okay. I'm sorry about this.
No problem.
Okay, reminder. Okay.
And there's Gail Walker. Welcome. Okay, let's begin again. I'm Jeff Mackler. I'm the National Secretary of Socialist Action, and I'm Socialist Action's candidate for President of the United States in 2020. Our subject today is the Cuban Revolution, and we are going to discuss everything from the status of the U.S. blockade, the status of Cuba's medical system and its fight against COVID-19, and Cuba's defense of Venezuelan people. Welcome, Gail Walker. Gail is the national co-coordinator of the National Network on Cuba and the director of IFCO Pastors for Peace. She is the proud daughter of Lucius Walker, who is renowned in Cuba for his consistent fight for the humanitarian aid to Cuba. We're also joined by Ike Nahum. Ike is the organizer for the International U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference and a founding member of New York, New Jersey, Cuba C. Welcome, Ike. and Gail. So let's
Yes.
begin. Um,
Thank you.
I have a crazy question for both of you. I noticed that Cuba has been nominated for the Nobel Prize for Peace, along with another nominee whose effort failed, named Donald Trump. Donald Trump decried the Nobel Committee for not giving him a Nobel Prize for Peace, as he believes he's a peace candidate. On the other hand, the Cuban people, who mightily deserve that award, have sent tens of thousands of doctors around the world to help the medical system, and especially with regard to COVID-19. Gail, can you tell us a little bit more about that effort? And we'll follow it up with Mike. Mike.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. I think it's important for us to find opportunities to really share information about Cuba, about the various initiatives that Cuba has been engaged in on multiple levels, one being certainly in the area of health. We're aware of the tremendous efforts that Cuba has made in the area of health since the triumph of its revolution. The ability to send doctors, exporting doctors as opposed to arms, as this country does, to various countries across the globe. And that's been really, a cornerstone of the commitment that Fidel and that the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people, Cuban government continues to make. We have witnessed the Henry Reeves Brigade, which really got its start when Hurricane Katrina slammed into New Orleans. Cuba, as many of your listeners will know, made an effort to send doctors to help out in the aftermath of Katrina, and that was heartlessly rejected by the Bush administration. But that brigade, that International Medical Brigade, began at that point in time. There are photos of Cuban doctors prepared to leave Cuba to travel to New Orleans to help out. And that energy, that spirit, that tenacity, that commitment continues to live on. And we know that there are over 35 different nations that have received doctors under the banner of the Henry Reeve Brigade to help out, most recently in the fight against COVID-19. Prior to that, in the fight against Ebola, prior to that, and struggling to combat natural disasters that might have hit any particular country. So that's really been a big part of who Cuba is, what its medical commitment has been, and the idea. And it wasn't just something that germinated here in the United States, but in various countries across the globe, was the desire to lift up Cuba and that commitment, and to honor them with the bestowing this coveted prize on them. And, a lot can be said about the Nobel Prize and some of the not so great things about the Nobel Peace Prize, but the idea of being able to lift up Cuba and its commitment in this area was really at the heart of the proposal. They did not receive the Nobel Peace Prize, but there is a campaign to continue to push for the next round for Cuba to be able to receive that prize. So I think it was a tremendous effort that was made not only, as I said, by people here in the United States, but in various countries, to really focus on that one aspect, just one of many aspects of Cuba and what it has to offer the world.
Yeah, Cuba's conscience was revealed to the world not long ago when a cruise ship had its passengers struck down with COVID-19, and they were refused entry to the United States. And they were welcomed by the Cuban government, who took people in, treated them, sent them back to their own countries in the best possible shape, and otherwise took a great risk. And here you have Cuba with perhaps the lowest COVID-19 rate in the world. By last count, I think 132 people have died in Cuba, whereas 216,000 people have died in the United States, with 8 million people afflicted. You've been to Cuba many, many times, perhaps a dozen. What's your take on the state of the Cuban Revolution today, its humanitarian aid, and the effect of the U.S. blockade?
Probably more than 24, but definitely yes. And in connection to what we're talking about with Cuban medical internationalism, this pandemic, the whole world crisis, actually highlights, for those of us that have defended the Cuban Revolution for decades and fought against the U.S. blockade, what we have always known about the strengths of the Cuban Revolution. And in this test, again, the Cuban Revolution and its legacy is being highlighted, and more people are conscious of it, including in the United States. The amazing performance you indicated, what in spite of the blockade, the intensification of it, actually, what Cuba has accomplished inside Cuba in terms of the rates of infection compared to Florida, compared to the United States, compared to much of Latin America. It's stunning. But at the same time, the question of the medical internationalism. And this has actually strengthened the Cuban Revolution, just like the revolutionary internationalism that Cuba showed in the 1970s in the fight, the decade-long fight to smash apartheid, and what that meant. That also exemplified Cuban internationalism and strengthened the Cuban Revolution at that time. And this is, in terms of your question, I think this is strengthening the Cuban Revolution also, but it's also weakening the U.S. imperialism and the attempts by the Trump administration to strengthen the blockade, which has happened throughout this whole thing. The most absurd example of this is this campaign that Pompeo and Trump have been going on to try to, and Menendez from New Jersey, and I think Marco Rubio's in on it too, this attempt to try to criminalize and to pressure governments to reject the medical internationalism, which has actually already led to great results. And so far, this campaign has been ridiculed around the world, and nobody has succumbed to that pressure. And tiny Caribbean countries that have received this medical internationalism and the Henry Reeve brigades have openly said they reject that, and they are grateful for the aid that Cuba has given.
Thanks. You know, recently I wrote an article about U.S. intervention. I was writing a piece on Venezuela and Iran, and I pointed out that in the turn of the century period, the Rockefeller clan virtually owned Venezuela as a private country. They had a summer home there, which they spent, and the Rockefellers accumulated through their then Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is now morphed into ExxonMobil. Rockefeller, John D., had accumulated wealth of $1.4 billion, which today is the equivalent of $400 billion, making Rockefeller would have made him the richest man on earth. They dominated Venezuela, owned the oil, and Rockefeller was appointed by the Franklin Roosevelt administration basically to be their private representative overseeing U.S. interests, overthrowing any country in Latin America that dared to control their own resources. The fact that I had a list of 45 different countries that the United States has organized interventions and war in Latin America at different times, and that includes the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. And of every one of these countries, only Cuba survives as a blockaded, isolated, beleaguered nation, which has the highest quality healthcare and a world-class educational system, a biological research system. And in my opinion, the reason for that is, of all the countries that were invaded, embargoed, blockaded, Cuba was the only one that dealt a decisive blow to the American status quo, to the American Batista-dominated economy. Cuba abolished capitalism. As Fidel said, we nationalized them down to the nails in the boots of their shoes. I think the Cuban example is more than relevant to the people of the world. What's the opinion that you get after 24 trips to Cuba on the support of the revolution, on the Cuban people, the gains that the revolution has brought, and their feelings about Cuba aiding Venezuela and other countries? I'll start with Gail, and we'll go to Ike on the same question.
Well, I think that there's so many different ways to approach that, but I think certainly Cuba, just by the fact that it has continued to stand up and in support of Venezuela, despite the relentless attacks by the U.S. government on the government there, the fact that Cuba has continued to recognize Venezuela as a friend, I think it speaks volumes about Cuba's commitment to its friends, and to the overarching commitment to support the people. Whether it's the Venezuelan people, it's the Cuban people, and when Cuba has needed a friend, Venezuela has been there, and Cuba has returned that level of friendship, in kind. They're really kindred spirits in so many ways, because they're both have been really relentlessly attacked by the U.S. government. And when you look at the efforts of the government, whether it's the government of Venezuela, the government of Cuba, to really stand up and be in solidarity with its people, to provide healthcare, to provide food, to provide opportunities for education, to share the limited resources that each country has with all of its people. There's a very similar narrative that takes place, and I think that that's very much a part of the reason that there's such respect for one another. The fact that in this day and age, when we really look at the despicable treatment of the U.S. government and its imperialistic nature, it's just relentless attack against the people of both nations. It makes sense that there would be this tremendous support for one another. So it's not surprising, I think, and it just really shows the principled nature that both nations, the leaders and the people of both nations have for people who have been vilified by the U.S. administration, whether that be under the Trump presidency and, whether it be the Democrats or the Republicans. It's not a partisan approach that's been taken. So I think it's really, but it really shows the spirit of both nations, in my opinion.
I think the hostility of the United States to Cuba is based on the simple fact that they decided to exercise their right to self-determination,
Absolutely,
take control of their resources, and organize society in the interests of the people, subordinating the private profit of the few to the needs of the many. Ike, does that spirit still exist in Cuba today?
Oh, there's definitely a continuity, because there's never been a break in that since the origins of the Cuban Revolution, and the Cuban working class and as the dominant class and the social relations ushered in by the Cuban Revolution in every level of society has created a legacy and a continuity and a generation. At the same time, that example throughout Latin America, because solidarity with Venezuela or any progressive or revolutionary struggle that develops, the United States government understands that Cuba will solidarize with that, will identify that, will promote those struggles. It happened in Central America in the 1980s, in the leaders and the history and the continuity of the Cuban Revolution. So this is a permanent thing. And over the last decade, 20 years, I think since Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1998, the end of 1998, there has been a revolutionary process that has unfolded in Venezuela that has met with utter hostility at every stage by the United States. Coup attempts, illegal seizures of assets, and then in the pandemic, this has not eased up. The drive to overthrow the Venezuelan government, the drive to temporarily, at least, we'll see what happens, but the mass struggle is on the upsurge in Bolivia. There's been a real pushback in U.S. policy over a number of years before Trump to shift the relationship of forces in the continent because they don't like the example of the process in Venezuela. They do not like, and they don't like the fact that these governments have very friendly relations with Cuba, and that Cuban doctors have gone to Bolivia, have gone to Brazil, have gone to Venezuela. I've witnessed in many, one of my trips that I organized to Cuba, we visited the clinics that miraculously cured people of blindness that were given to people that came from all over Latin America, that at the time Venezuela provided a lot of financing and Cuba provided, it was Operation Milagros, miracle. And we saw this, we saw the impact. So this example, the political example of the Cuban Revolution is what they cannot tolerate. But at the same time, we know that there has been a shift in the differences because it is U.S. policy that is very isolated now. And we see this now in the pandemic, that dozens of countries in the Caribbean have had Cuban medical brigades come. That solidarity, they've stood up at the United Nations year after year. So it is U.S. policy that is in crisis and isolated. And we feel in the broader Cuba solidarity movement, which all three of us are part of, and many, many others, that in 2021, we feel that fighting the blockade and dealing blows against the blockade is on our agenda on all fronts. And if I can give a quick plug before I give you the back, if people could go to the website of an international coalition that both Gail and I are organizing around for, it's US-CubaNormalization.org, which also has lots of information on the Saving Lives campaign that we have organized for US-Cuba-Canada medical cooperation.
Thanks, Ike. You know, the spectacle of the United States appointing Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela did not go unnoticed by the peoples of the world, nor did the spectacle of the United States literally stealing money from Citgo oil accounts owned by Venezuela and sending them to its appointed president, Juan Guaido. In fact, they didn't send most of it. They took most of it for themselves. And then the spectacle of watching the events live at the Venezuelan border with Colombia, where these invaders, backed and financed by the United States and its Colombian government ally, planned to march into the country and take over. Unbelievable. The only thing that stopped them was the millions of people in the streets of Venezuela that had no interest in a US imposed government. And then, roughly about the same time, you see the United States now responsible for organizing a coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Evo Morales in Bolivia. The hand of the United States and the OAS is now obvious. And what did they do? They installed a right-wing dictator that proceeded to reverse the gains of the Bolivian people, and once again to impose U.S. interests. In my day, in the early 1980s, Grenada was a revolutionary example. I went there as part of a solidarity effort. I was the head of the U.S. Grenada Friendship Society, and Maurice Bishop was a personal friend. He lived in Brooklyn, New York, and used to come to our public forums. He made a revolution, ousted the US-backed dictator, Sir Matthew Eric Gary, and with the help of the Cubans, did miraculous things. The Grenadians were the poorest nation, 21 by 10 miles in the entire Caribbean. 5,000 Grenadians used to go in the equivalent of rowboats to fish. And their main crop was nutmeg that they grew on a virtual volcanic mountain with a road around it. With the aid of the Cubans, they started a literacy campaign. They wiped out illiteracy. They had a fishing campaign. The Cuban gave them 13 major boats for fishing that saved tens of thousands of lives, a refrigeration system that allowed them to preserve the fish that they caught and begin to be an independent country. And then the United States organized a pretext, invaded the country, and installed a government. We've seen this in Grenada in 1983, in Cuba in 1961, in Venezuela today. United States backed and financed and armed the Guatemalan dictatorship that killed 400,000 people, the Somoza dictatorship that killed 80,000 people, and the same in regard to every country. Here you have the imperialist beast, if I may use the expression, supporting the most reactionary military dictatorships. And I have to add, in 2.5 weeks, President Trump may appoint himself the president of the United States, despite the fact that he loses the election. A shock, but an eye-opener for what is to come, and another example of the power of the Cuban Revolution to prevail against all odds. Gail, could you comment on that, but also tell us a little bit more about what you do as director of IFCO Pastors for Peace and how people can get involved, and also what about the National Network on Cuba, a network of maybe 70 to 100 organizations that do solidarity work with Cuba in a united way that's been around for a long time. How can our listeners get involved with both?
Well, you really just ran through a very intense history of U.S. intervention in various parts of the world. Heartbreaking to witness what happened in Grenada, as we're heartbroken to see what's happening in the attacks against Venezuela and Cuba. And you spoke of in various parts of Central America, Guatemala, and also in Nicaragua, where there were, definitely efforts to really lift up the support of the people through a literacy campaign vis-a-vis what they learned from the Cubans, to provide health care, to provide support in various parts of that nation. I recall when we could talk about the Sandinista government really supporting the people across the country, but certainly looking at what was happening in the Afro Nicaraguan communities of Bluefields, and just the efforts to really try to support the people across the entire nation. And a lot of that was very much connected to the support and the encouragement that that Nicaraguans were receiving from the Cubans. But I I think that history, it really informs us and today when we look at some of those tremendous accomplishments and the courage and the tenacity of the people who have pushed back against these efforts to overthrow their countries and to install you know horrible governments to try to really impose the will of the U.S. government. That there has been that kind of strength and determination is inspiring. And I think that that's what inspires us to continue to do the work that we do now. At IFCO Pastors for Peace, I have been sitting in the director's chair for the last 10 years. My dad passed away in 2010, Reverend Lucius Walker, who was our founding director, and really was a visionary in terms of taking IFCO into the direction of supporting the fight for social justice on the national level, international level, making links between the two. And in many ways, while IFCO began doing work in various parts of the world, for me, in some ways, Nicaragua was a birthplace for my connection to IFCO, because it was there that we were traveling on a passenger ferry that was attacked, and that led to the formation of Pastors for Peace. It was attacked by Nicaraguan Contras, and it was an opportunity that my father seized. He was one of the 29 people who were wounded. 2 people were killed in that attack, but seized that opportunity to formulate Pastors for Peace as a people-to-people foreign policy initiative to get people engaged and involved, and really pushing back against U.S. foreign policy. And we've been organizing the caravans ever since. And in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, and over the last several years, since 1992 in Cuba, and seeing it as an important way to encourage people to get engaged in fighting U.S. policy. So that's a big part of what we continue to do. We've been blessed to serve as the entity to support ELAM, the students that have gotten scholarships to study medicine at ELAM, the Spanish acronym for the Latin American School of Medicine. To date, there are nearly 200 U.S. graduates of that program, joining students from over 120 other different nations. So that's been really a cornerstone part of the work that we do, as we continue to also work with US-based progressive organizations through our fiscal sponsorship project. So there's so many things to say about an organization that's 53 years old, but that's a big part of what we continue to do. And we continue to find ways to expand our mission of supporting the disenfranchised. And real quickly, National Network on Cuba, I've been, for the last several years, one of the 5 co-chairs, working with an organization trying to support the various groups, as Ike was mentioning, that have been really engaged in pushing back against the U.S. blockade. And we're hoping to find additional and new and creative ways to engage all of our collective effort to really, in 2021, put a real concerted effort into that being the year that we really break the back of the U.S. Genocidal blockade against Cuba. So a lot of work going on a lot of different fronts, but I'm feeling, like I said, inspired by not only the history, much of which you just reiterated, but the excitement and energy of our network that's really engaged in a way that they haven't been in a long time.
Can I say something, Jeff, just to follow up real quick? Because we have a growing movement against the blockade over the last 6 months with the pandemic. Our broader movement has organized a series of very successful webinars. We've met thousands and thousands of new people, boosted the work in very many cities, new cities, made international contacts. But I just want to say that the role of IFCO, Pastors for Peace, and the Caravans and Venceremos Brigade, that what we really set an example, I think, and I know Gail and I have worked together for many years in the New York, New Jersey area, but I think our movement has set an example of unity and working together around this issue. That's an example for a lot of people. If you look at the sponsorship of the initiatives we've taken in the last period, it's been a really broad range of organizations that are working together. And we don't know what's going to happen with the election. We know the political crisis in the United States is going to continue to deepen under the whip of the pandemic, the economic depression. And we know that the terrain that we're going to be fighting on against the blockade, in the context of the tremendous authority of Cuba and the tremendous contempt that's held for U.S. policy, that we do feel that 2021 is going to be the year that we need to build on that unity and that non-sectarian approach and focus on defeating the blockade. Because even though Cuba is a sterling example, as we pointed out again and again, of internationalism, it is also a fact that the blockade, even though it's isolated politically, is having an accumulating effect on Cuba. There is growing pressure on Cuba to try to asphyxiate it by the U.S. policy, and we must counter that, and we think we're in a position to more effectively counter it, more openings to fight it than maybe we've ever had for this movement.
You know, in the late 1990s, I visited Cuba twice, and I met with the leadership of the Communist Party's North American section, and I asked them what we could do in the United States to keep the United States hands off Cuba. We came up with the idea of a conference at UC Berkeley. We arranged meetings between the Cuban government officials at the intersection in Washington and at the United Nations to visit representatives of UC Berkeley, and established a date in 1999 for a week-long Dialogue with Cuba conference. That was the time when the Pope visited Cuba and opened up some avenues of discussion. The Cubans sent, at the invitation of the University of California, not only at Berkeley, but the statewide system supported by the regents, the Cubans sent 30 officials, leaders in healthcare, in diplomacy, in athletics. They sent their Olympic champions, in education, in medicine, in fighting HIV. It was an incredible dialogue with the equivalent of the United States. We had Steffi Woolhander from Harvard on the same platform as the head of Cuba's HIV program, which was also incredibly successful. We had a week where Cubans visited every university and college within 90 miles of UC Berkeley. 2,000 people attended the conference, and it opened the eyes of so many people to what had been prohibited information about the Cuban Revolution. I think these possibilities, when people learn the truth about the Cuban Revolution, the reality of the revolution yesterday and today, will, as Ike said, help us smash open the doors to end this vicious, illegal blockade. To my knowledge, the vote on the blockade in the United Nations is the whole world says yes in the General Assembly, and one or perhaps two nations, the United States and Israel say no. And yet, in the face of worldwide opposition, the United States continues an illegal blockade, not to mention ongoing terrorist activities. Historically, the banana crop of Cuba was wiped out by U.S. U.S. Poisoning agencies. They introduced the swine flu that killed 500,000 Cubans. Pigs in Cuba. They supported the terrorist groups based in Miami that bombed Cuba. The record of United States vicious and illegal actions against Cuba is incredible, and most people don't know about it. So I want to thank you both for your incredible work on Cuba, and give you each your last 5 minutes or so to sum up for any comments. But be sure to tell our listeners how they can contact you, what your email addresses are, informations, and website. I'm Jeff Mackler. I'm the National Secretary of Socialist Action and its candidate for the US presidency. By the way, if I'm elected, we will end the blockade immediately. And we will invite you and Gail and the leadership of the Cuban Revolution to the White House for the most wonderful barbecue, vegetarian and otherwise, that you've ever seen, and open up a new era of peace and friendship between the best fighters for democracy, freedom, and honesty in the United States and the revolutionary Cuban government. I'll also add that that Socialist Action, from the very beginning, I was a founder of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee way back, and the chair of the chapter when I was a college at Antioch College. We mobilized mass protests when the US invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuba has been closest to our hearts. It's our revolution. They're our neighbors, and the Cuban people have taught us so much. So the last word is with Gail and Ike, and be sure to tell our listeners how to contact you. You can contact us at socialistaction.org. That's our website, or socialistaction@lmi.net. Gail, it's your turn.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for this opportunity. It's always great to be able to really lift up and talk about Cuba. It's great to share this platform with my friend Ike. As he's mentioned, we've worked together in many different capacities to really, highlight the wonderful, tremendous accomplishments of Cuba, and to really push for fundamental change in U.S. policy toward Cuba. As you were talking, I was just struck by the two words, right? Collaboration and cooperation, and that's very much a part of Cuba's DNA. As we've talked about this, Cuba has really, had a tremendous impact on the world in the area of health and education and the environment, and it has been a real leader when it comes to the issues that most impact and affect people. And so it's not surprising that despite this 60-plus-year-old blockade, genocidal blockade, the foot of the US government on the neck of the Cuban people for more than 60 years, despite that, they have been willing to give and to share, to collaborate. They have opened their doors of their universities to allow our youngest and brightest people from the US who are committed to community medicine to travel there to study medicine at the Latin American School of Medicine under full scholarship, with the understanding that they'll return home and help transform healthcare here in the United States in the ways that we need it most. despite that blockade, they're offering that opportunity for our young people to do that. And by the way, the deadline for due to COVID has been extended to November 1st. The opportunity still is out there, and we want to make sure that people know that this is a tremendous gift, and to reach out to IFCO to learn more about that. They can go to our website at ifconews.org and learn more about not only the med school scholarship program, the caravan, a little bit about the history of IFCO, but IFCONEWS, ifconews.org is a place where they can learn more about the work that we've been doing. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Cuba. Thank you, Ike. Thanks. I just think that it's anytime we have the opportunity to talk about our friends, I'm blessed. I know that Ike is going to share with us information about the upcoming conference that we want to encourage as many people as possible to also attend virtually. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add before Ike wraps it up that I believe that the medical institutions in the state of California have accredited students who graduate from the medical program in Cuba. So it is a first-rate medical program that produces accredited doctors for service around the world. Every nation that needs them, including nations with governments that are hostile to Cuba. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit Italy, Cubans sent doctors there.
Yes, they did.
Coordinating whatever differences it had to the life and health of the people of the world.
Right.
That's the example of Cuba from A to Z. Ike, you have the final word to
Thank you, and thank you to Socialist Action for your consistent work as part of the broader movement to end the blockade and to show solidarity with Cuba and your support for the Cuban Revolution. And again, it points to the unity that we're building on. I think you mentioned in your previous remarks about it's in your heart. And there's so many people like that have been touched by Cuba, that have gone down there, that have seen the example, that is the news of it, just like they have tried to suppress in the capitalist media, just the facts on what Cuba has accomplished and what Cuba has done. Well, that's to be expected because, as we all know, it's that example. But this is, nevertheless, the truth gets out, and many people feel the same way. That's why we feel that the truth is starting to emerge, that the figures don't lie. Florida, the thousands and thousands of deaths, and in a state that has twice the population of Cuba, which is 11.3 million, that has had 121 deaths, that has made big advances in that. So all of these friends that Cuba has, and it's shown in the UN vote, it's shown in our growing movement, that this is going to be our focus on many fronts in 2021. November 13th to 15th, we're going to have a fabulous weekend. Again, go to that website, us-cubanormalization.org for details. I'm sure the IFCO website and the NNOC website, Canadian Network on Cuba will all have these details. We're going to have a great concert on Friday night that we're working with Hot House Collective on. Saturday, we're going to have sessions with Cubans and Cuban officials, and hopefully, well, it's going to be a great program. The publicity is going to be out in another day or two, the additional publicity. Everybody look for it. We're going to be sending that out. And look in your local area for the solidarity group or coalition that you can get involved in the work, because I'm an old railroad engineer, and we're full throttle for 2021 to smash the blockade.
Thank you, Ike Nahum, Gail Walker. You are magnificent examples of the kind of solidarity that we need to build around the country. we need to support the simple principle of the right of the people to self-determination, the right to determine their own future. That applies to the Cuban people and to all poor and oppressed nations on earth who suffer the horrors of imperialist intervention and control. Cuba is our example in socialist action and to the world. Thank you again. Look forward to your conferences and to our continued collaboration with the National Network on Cuba and IFCO Pastors for Peace. Wish your conference the best success. Keep us posted. Let's have articles in our newspaper on it. And thank you for attending. I'll ask our engineer to call our wonderful webinar to an end, and good evening to you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Jeff.
you. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.